Every day, the world gives us headlines. But headlines are not history. Headlines are fragments. They tell us what happened, but rarely what it means. Today's subject is real. The facts are real. The pressures behind it are real. Governments are making decisions. Markets are reacting. Armies, companies, voters, and leaders are all moving inside the same storm. This video is not fiction. It is not an invented speech. It is not the voice of Churchill returned from the grave. It is a modern geopolitical essay written through a Churchillian lens, a lens of war, money, courage, weakness, empire, technology, and power. So before we judge the day, we must understand it. And before we understand it, we must ask the only question that truly matters. What is this moment trying to tell us about the world that is coming? To understand Iran, oil, and the fire beneath the markets, one must first abandon a comforting illusion that the Middle East is merely a region of distant conflicts, ancient rivalries, religious passions, and diplomatic crises that belong to someone else. That illusion is pleasant. It is also dangerous. The Middle East is not only a geography of war, it is one of the great pressure chambers of the modern world. It is a region where energy, empire, faith, sea routes, military power, inflation, currency markets, public anger, and political survival meet in a space so narrow that a single spark can illuminate the whole global system. There are places on the map that appear small until history touches them. The Strait of Hormuz is one of them. It is not wide in the imagination of ordinary life. It is not a household name in the way New York, London, Beijing, or Paris are household names. Yet through this narrow maritime artery passes a share of the world's energy so large that the price of bread, fuel, electricity, shipping, and debt can tremble when that waterway is threatened. The US Energy Information Administration reported that in 2024, about 20 million barrels per day of oil flowed through the Strait of Hormuz, equal to roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. The International Energy Agency describes the strait as carrying around a quarter of world seaborne oil trade. That is not merely a statistic. It is a warning written in barrels, tankers, insurance contracts, refinery schedules, naval patrols, and household budgets. It tells us that modern civilization, with all its screens, satellites, algorithms, delivery apps, electric dreams, and financial sophistication, still rests upon physical routes that can be seen, blocked, mined, threatened, insured, rerouted, or defended. The digital age has not abolished geography. It has made the consequences of geography faster. Iran matters because Iran sits near this geography, understands this geography, and has spent decades learning how to convert pressure into influence. It matters not only because of its army, not only because of its missiles, not only because of its nuclear program, not only because of its alliances and proxies, not only because of its rivalry with Israel, the Gulf monarchies, and the United States. Iran matters because it stands at the junction between military risk and economic fear. It occupies a position where words can move markets, threats can affect shipping, sanctions can redirect oil flows, and uncertainty itself can become a kind of power. The first mistake in analysing Iran is to reduce it to a headline. Headlines are impatient. They demand heroes and villains, beginnings and endings, explosions and ceasefires, victories and defeats. But states do not live in headlines. They live in memory, pressure, geography, fear, ambition, survival, and calculation. Iran is not merely an event. It is a strategic actor. It is a civilization state with revolutionary institutions, regional ambitions, economic vulnerabilities, deep historical grievances, and a sophisticated understanding of how to operate beneath the threshold of total war. To speak of Iran only as a crisis is to misunderstand the nature of the crisis. The second mistake is to imagine that oil has become old-fashioned. Many in comfortable societies have convinced themselves that because the future is electric, the present is no longer petroleum. This is false. The future may be transformed by batteries, grids, renewables, nuclear power, and new technologies. But the present still moves on oil. Planes fly on refined fuel. Ships carry goods across oceans. Trucks feed cities. Petrochemicals shape plastics, fertilizers, packaging, medicine, textiles, and industrial life. Military machines consume energy. Agricultural systems depend on fuel and inputs. Even when a household does not buy oil directly, it buys the consequences of oil in almost everything it consumes. Oil is not merely a commodity. Oil is speed. Oil is logistics. Oil is military reach. Oil is industrial continuity. Oil is taxation. Oil is inflation. Oil is social peace. Oil is the hidden bloodstream of a civilization that likes to speak in the language of innovation while still eating food delivered by diesel, wearing goods carried by ships, and voting in anger when fuel prices rise. This is why oil remains political power. Not because the world has learned nothing, not because energy transition is meaningless, but because transition does not erase dependency overnight. A society may dream in green language and still panic when gasoline rises. A government may promise a post-carbon future and still fear a winter of high heating bills. A central bank may speak of inflation expectations and still be humbled by a tanker route thousands of miles away. An election may be decided not by a theory of geopolitics, but by the price displayed on a pump. There is a brutal democracy in energy prices. They speak to everyone. The minister hears them in bond markets. The banker hears them in inflation data. The factory hears them in operating costs. The farmer hears them in fertilizer and transport. The parent hears them in grocery bills. The commuter hears them before dawn, at the station, the pump, or the monthly utility statement. A missile may be launched far away. A sanction may be signed in a capital city. A tanker may wait outside a strait. But the consequence arrives quietly in the life of the ordinary person, disguised as a higher bill. This is the chain that connects Tehran to the supermarket, the Gulf to the mortgage, the shipping lane to the interest rate, the naval patrol to the family budget. It is not always immediate. It is not always simple. There are buffers, inventories, alternative routes, producers with spare capacity, governments with reserves, traders with hedges, and central banks with models. But the connection exists, and because it exists, markets react before the public fully understands why. Markets are not moral philosophers. They do not wait for clarity. They do not need certainty to move. They move on probabilities, fear, positioning, liquidity, rumours, satellite images, diplomatic language, military posture, inventory data, and the possibility that tomorrow may be worse than today. When the Middle East darkens, traders ask not only what has happened, but what may happen next. Will a shipping route close? Will tankers be targeted? Will insurance premiums rise? Will refineries lose supply? Will a regional conflict draw in outside powers? Will sanctions tighten? Will retaliation be symbolic, limited, or strategic? Will the market wake up tomorrow to a new map of risk? That is why headlines about peace can move oil prices. Headlines about war can move oil prices. Headlines about negotiations, sanctions, missiles, naval deployments, pipeline attacks, refinery outages, drone strikes, shipping warnings, or diplomatic messages can move oil prices. The market is not reacting only to barrels already lost. It is reacting to the possibility of barrels that may be lost, routes that may become dangerous, and governments that may be forced into decisions they did not want to make. In recent reporting, oil prices have moved sharply around signs of conflict and possible diplomatic relief, including reports of US-Iran peace efforts that pushed Brent below $100 before prices partially recovered. That movement is itself a lesson. A market can fear a war before a war reaches its maximum form. A market can price relief before peace is secure. A market can breathe 1 hour and tighten the next. This is not irrational. It is the behavior of a system trying to survive uncertainty. The modern world has built astonishing financial instruments around risk, but it has not abolished risk. It has merely traded one kind of vulnerability for another. In earlier centuries, a kingdom feared that its granaries would burn, its ports would be blockaded, or its armies would be cut off from supplies. Today, a global economy fears shipping disruption, insurance repricing, futures volatility, inflation expectations, currency pressure, and the political consequences of energy pain. The vocabulary has changed. The essence has not. Civilization has always depended upon routes. The Roman road, the Venetian sea lane, the British coaling station, the Suez Canal, the transatlantic convoy, the pipeline, the fibre optic cable, the LNG terminal, the container port, the oil tanker corridor. These are not side details of history. They are history's arteries. When arteries remain open, societies grow complacent. When they are threatened, societies suddenly remember that prosperity is not an atmosphere, it is a structure. The Middle East is one of the places where that structure is most visible. It is a region where land power and sea power meet, where energy producers sit near energy consumers' lifelines, where American military guarantees Gulf wealth, Israeli security doctrine, Iranian pressure, European vulnerability, Chinese demand, and global market psychology overlap. It's a region where the local is never only local. A confrontation may begin as a regional matter, but oil gives it a passport to the world. This does not mean every crisis becomes catastrophe. It does not mean every threat becomes closure, every exchange becomes war, or every rise in oil becomes a global recession. Serious analysis must resist panic. The world has absorbed many shocks before. Producers adapt. Consumers reduce demand. Governments release reserves. Traders reroute cargoes. Diplomats negotiate under pressure. Militaries deter. Markets overreact and then correct. There is always resilience in the system. But resilience is not invincibility. And the more complex a system becomes, the more dangerous it is to confuse smooth functioning with permanent safety. A bridge that has not collapsed is not proof that weight no longer matters. A market that recovered yesterday is not proof that tomorrow carries no danger. A shipping route that remained open through one crisis is not guaranteed through the next. Peace, like credit, is often taken for granted until the day it is withdrawn. Iran understands this. So do the United States, Israel, the Gulf states, China, Europe, and every serious energy trader on Earth. They understand that the question is not only whether Iran can destroy or defeat its adversaries in a conventional sense. The question is whether Iran can impose costs, create hesitation, raise uncertainty, complicate calculations, and make every actor ask whether the next move is worth the price. That is the art of pressure. It is not the same as conquest. It is the ability to force others to measure their strength against your capacity for disruption. The Middle East is filled with such calculations. The United States has overwhelming military power, but it also carries global responsibilities, domestic fatigue, election pressures, debt burdens, and the memory of long wars. Israel has extraordinary military capabilities and a profound security imperative, but it also lives in a region where tactical success can create strategic escalation. Gulf states possess wealth, energy infrastructure, and diplomatic flexibility, but they are exposed to missiles, drones, shipping disruption, and market panic. Europe depends on stability it cannot fully enforce. China depends on energy flows it does not fully control. Iran faces economic pressure and military danger, yet it has learned how to make vulnerability part of its strategy. This is why a crisis involving Iran cannot be read like a simple battlefield map. The battlefield is not only land, sea, and air, it is the oil market, It is the insurance market. It is the currency market. It is the central bank meeting. It is the shipping schedule. It is the diplomatic corridor. It is the public mood in countries far from the Gulf. It is the fear inside every government that inflation, once awakened, may return with a political force greater than any speech can contain. Inflation is not merely an economic number. It is a social emotion. It changes how people see the future. It turns patience into anger. It makes wages feel false, savings feel unsafe, and leaders sound detached. When prices rise too quickly, people begin to believe that the system is lying to them. They may not know the details of shipping routes or refinery margins. They may not follow the Strait of Hormuz or Iranian sanctions. But they know when life becomes more expensive. This is why energy shocks are so politically dangerous. They do not remain in the energy sector. They spread. Fuel affects transport. Transport affects food. Food affects wages. Wages affect inflation expectations. Inflation expectations affect central banks. Central banks affect interest rates. Interest rates affect mortgages, business loans, public debt, stock valuations, and government budgets. A crisis in one region can become a tightening of credit in another. A tanker route can become a household argument. A geopolitical risk premium can become a political revolt. The ordinary person may never read an oil market report. Yet the oil market reads the ordinary person's future. It reads whether they will spend or save, whether they will blame the government, whether they will tolerate higher interest rates, whether they will trust institutions, whether they will accept sacrifice. This is the harsh secret of geopolitics. Most people do not experience it as geopolitics. They experience it as price. A family doesn't say, the regional balance of deterrence has shifted. They say, fuel is too expensive. A shop owner doesn't say, maritime insurance premiums have adjusted to geopolitical risk. They say, delivery costs are killing the margin. A young worker does not say, energy inflation is complicating monetary policy. They say, rent, food, and transport are rising again. A voter does not say, the Strait of Hormuz is a structural choke point in global petroleum flows. They say, the people in charge have lost control. And in politics, perception is not decoration. Perception becomes power. A government may argue that the cause is foreign, that the shock is imported, that markets are global, that the crisis began elsewhere. It may even be correct. But correctness is not always protection. Citizens judge by experience. If they feel poorer, they become impatient. If they become impatient, politics hardens. If politics hardens, leaders become more reactive. And when leaders become reactive in a crisis, miscalculation becomes easier. This is why the Middle East can shake the world. Not because every crisis there destroys the global economy, but because the region sits upon several layers of vulnerability at once. It is a security theatre. It is an energy hub. It is a shipping corridor. It is a diplomatic battlefield. It is a religious and ideological landscape. It is a financial risk zone. It is a place where local decisions can have global consequences because global systems have chosen, over many decades, to depend on routes and resources concentrated in dangerous places. The word chosen matters. The world did not accidentally build this structure. It was built through empire, industry, war, trade, convenience, and profit. Great powers wanted access. Producers wanted revenue. Consumers wanted energy. Companies wanted supply. Militaries wanted reach. Financial markets wanted liquidity. Politicians wanted growth. Everyone wanted the benefits of connection. Fewer wanted to pay attention to the fragility that connection created. The modern economy is magnificent in its efficiency. It is also merciless in its dependence. It has reduced waste, accelerated trade, lowered costs, and connected continents. But efficiency often removes slack. It trims the fat that once served as protection. It assumes the route will remain open, the ship will arrive, the price will remain manageable, the insurance will be available, the contract will be honoured, The central bank will contain the damage, and the public will endure the pain. These assumptions hold until they do not. A fragile peace is still peace, but it is not the same as security. A shipping route that requires constant deterrence is open, but not safe in the deepest sense. A market that depends on every actor remaining rational is liquid, but not calm. A region where missiles, sanctions, naval forces, proxies, energy infrastructure, and public rhetoric coexist is stable only in the way a loaded table is stable before one leg cracks. There is a temptation, especially in prosperous societies, to treat geopolitics as theatre. Something dramatic, something distant, something to watch, discuss, condemn, or applaud. But geopolitics is not theatre. It is the architecture beneath daily life. It decides which routes are open, which currencies are trusted, which alliances hold, which prices rise, which governments survive, and which assumptions must be buried. Iran matters because it reminds the world that power is not only measured by GDP, aircraft carriers, or stock market capitalization. Power is also the ability to disturb the calculations of others. Oil matters because it reminds the world that the future has not yet replaced the present. Markets matter because they reveal fear before speeches admit it. Inflation matters because it transforms distant danger into domestic anger. The Middle East matters because it is one of the few regions where all these forces meet at once. When one hears a headline about Iran, one must listen for the deeper machinery. Behind the headline is not only a government in Tehran, not only a statement from Washington, not only an Israeli calculation, not only a Gulf concern, not only a Chinese interest, not only a European fear. Behind the headline is a chain of consequences. A chain that moves from pressure to price, from price to inflation, from inflation to interest rates, from interest rates to politics, from politics to power. This is the fire beneath the markets. It is not always visible. On calm days, finance appears separate from war. Screens glow. Indices rise. Analysts speak in measured tones. Investors debate earnings, productivity, artificial intelligence, consumer demand, and central bank guidance. Then a region trembles, and suddenly the old truths return. The market remembers the sea. It remembers fuel. It remembers geography. It remembers that the world economy is not floating above history. It is built inside history. That memory can arrive suddenly. A shipping advisory, a drone strike, a sanction package, a diplomatic breakdown, a naval movement, a refinery incident, a speech by a leader under pressure, a rumour of negotiations, a denial, a retaliation, a ceasefire report. A single phrase from an official can alter expectations because expectations are the battlefield on which markets move first. This is why escalation does not need to be complete to be costly. The fear of escalation has its own price. Insurance rises before disaster. Oil rises before shortage. Investors move before confirmation. Governments prepare before announcement. Consumers pay before they understand. Fear, in a connected economy, is not merely an emotion. It is a cost structure. And yet, fear must be understood, not worshipped. The goal of serious analysis is not to terrify. It is to clarify. Panic is useless. Complacency is worse. Between them lies the discipline of seeing the world as it is. Dangerous, connected, resilient, fragile, rational in parts, irrational in moments, and always shaped by the decisions of human beings under pressure. The Middle East teaches that history does not retire. It changes uniforms. Once, empires fought for ports, canals, and coaling stations. Now states compete over shipping lanes, sanctions, energy infrastructure, drone corridors, missile ranges, data cables, LNG flows, and market expectations. The instruments have changed. The struggle for leverage remains. Iran is not the only force in this story. Oil is not the only commodity that matters. The Middle East is not the only dangerous region. But in this episode, Iran and oil reveal a wider truth. The global economy is more political than it admits, and politics is more economic than it pretends. The two are not separate kingdoms. They are one battlefield with different uniforms. When policymakers speak of stability, they often mean the absence of visible crisis. But true stability is deeper. It means the ability to absorb shocks without losing direction. It means routes with alternatives, energy systems with resilience, diplomacy with channels, militaries with discipline, markets with transparency, publics with trust, and leaders with the courage to act before panic demands action. The danger today is that many systems have become excellent at reacting and poor at preparing. Preparation is not glamorous. It rarely wins applause. It does not produce the drama of emergency. It looks boring until the crisis comes. Then it looks like wisdom, energy reserves, diversified supply, disciplined budgets, credible diplomacy, strong alliances, secure shipping, realistic defense planning, and honest communication with the public are not luxuries. They are the quiet architecture of survival. But modern politics often rewards the opposite. It rewards denial until denial fails. It rewards slogans where strategy is required. It rewards short-term comfort over long-term resilience. It rewards leaders who promise that danger can be wished away, outsourced, delayed, or blamed upon someone else. The world cannot afford such illusions around Iran, oil, and the Middle East. The cost of illusion is paid in markets first and in societies later. What then is this moment trying to tell us about the world that is coming? It is telling us that energy remains destiny, even in an age that dreams of escaping it. It is telling us that geography still commands respect, even from the most advanced economies. It is telling us that markets are not cold machines, but nervous systems. It is telling us that inflation can be defeated in one season and revived in another if the world forgets the sources of price. It is telling us that the ordinary citizen is never truly protected from distant disorder. It is telling us that peace is not a background condition. Peace is an achievement and sometimes a temporary one. Above all, it is telling us that modern civilization rests on fragile roots, fragile assumptions, and fragile peace. The roots are maritime, financial, diplomatic, technological, and psychological. The assumptions are that energy will flow, that deterrence will hold, that leaders will calculate wisely, that markets will remain liquid, that the public will endure, and that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. The peace is fragile because it depends not only on strength, but on restraint. Not only on deterrence, but on judgment. Not only on weapons, but on the ability to know when not to use them. The Middle East is not far away. Iran is not merely a headline. Oil is not merely a price. Markets are not merely numbers. They are all part of the same structure. And beneath that structure, there is fire. To understand Iran, one must resist the poverty of simplification. Iran is often described in the language of crisis, a nuclear crisis, a missile crisis, a sanctions crisis, a proxy crisis, a regional crisis. These phrases are not false, but they are incomplete. They describe the smoke, not the furnace. They describe the event, not the design. Iran is not merely a headline that appears when oil rises or missiles fly. Iran is a strategic actor that has learned to survive under pressure, to speak through pressure, and to make pressure itself an instrument of statecraft. This does not mean Iran is all-powerful. It is not. It has weaknesses, economic strain, sanctions, domestic discontent, technological limits, demographic pressures, diplomatic isolation in parts of the world, and the constant danger that a calibrated move may provoke a response larger than intended. But weakness does not mean helplessness. In geopolitics, power is not only the ability to dominate. Power is also the ability to impose cost. Power is the ability to complicate the enemy's choices. Power is the ability to make stronger states hesitate, calculate, delay, divide, and fear the consequences of their own strength. Iran has built much of its regional strategy around this principle. It cannot match the United States ship for ship, aircraft for aircraft, dollar for dollar, alliance for alliance. It cannot defeat Israel in a conventional war in any simple or guaranteed sense. It cannot outspend the Gulf states. It cannot command global finance. Yet Iran does not need to do these things to matter. It needs to be able to make others ask a darker question. If we strike, what follows? If we tighten sanctions, what breaks? If we push Tehran to the wall, what does Tehran choose to burn? That question is the beginning of Iranian pressure. Iran's power is not concentrated in one place. It is layered. There is the visible state, the government, the armed forces, the Revolutionary Guard, the missile program, the nuclear program, the diplomatic apparatus, the oil sector, the security institutions. Then there is the wider network of influence, allied militias, political relationships, armed groups, ideological partners, pressure points across the region. Some relationships are direct. Some are looser. Some are strategic. Some are opportunistic. Serious analysis must avoid pretending every actor is a puppet, just as it must avoid pretending Iran has no influence. The truth is more complicated and more important. Iran has spent decades building a regional architecture of pressure that can operate below the level of formal war. This is one of the defining features of the modern Middle East. War does not always arrive wearing the uniform of war. It arrives as a drone attack, a rocket launch, a cyber operation, a militia movement, a shipping threat, a weapons shipment, a sanction, a covert strike, a targeted assassination, a warning, a denial, a diplomatic message delivered through an intermediary, or a statement calibrated to frighten markets without forcing a battlefield. The region has become an arena of thresholds. Every actor tests the line. Every actor tries to hurt without being hurt too much in return. Every actor seeks leverage without inviting catastrophe. This is why Iran's strategy cannot be understood only through the old language of armies crossing borders. Iran often operates through ambiguity. Ambiguity can be frustrating to outside observers, but it is valuable to states under pressure. It creates space for denial. It complicates retaliation. It forces adversaries to debate responsibility. It divides allies who may agree on the threat but disagree on the response. It buys time. It raises the cost of certainty. In traditional war, the battlefield is clearer. One army advances, another retreats. A city falls, a treaty is signed. But in the art of pressure, victory is often not a flag raised over a capital. Victory may be a delayed decision, a frightened investor, a higher oil price, a divided coalition, a reluctant president, a distracted enemy, a naval deployment that costs more than the threat that caused it, or a political crisis inside a rival state. Iran has learned that fear can travel faster than missiles. A missile must reach a target. Fear reaches the market before the missile arrives. A drone must cross airspace. Fear crosses continents. A ship must be attacked to create damage, but the possibility of attack can already raise insurance costs, alter shipping behaviour, and force governments to prepare for the worst. This is not mystical. It is strategic psychology. Modern markets are built on expectations, and expectations are vulnerable to fear. The same principle applies to deterrence. Deterrence is not simply having weapons. Deterrence is convincing others that using their weapons against you may cost more than they are willing to pay. For a weaker state, deterrence often depends on making punishment unpredictable, dispersed, and politically painful. If an adversary cannot be certain where the response will come from, when it will come, or how wide it may become, that uncertainty itself becomes part of the defense. Iran's deterrence is therefore not only military, it is regional, economic, psychological, and political. It says, in effect, we may not defeat you in a direct contest, but we can make victory expensive. We may not control the global oil market, but we can disturb the assumptions upon which it rests. We may not command the sea, but we are near a sea lane the world cannot ignore. We may not destroy your alliances, but we can test their unity. We may not be able to prevent every strike, but we can make every strike a doorway into uncertainty. This is why Tehran's relationship with Washington has been so enduringly tense. The United States is not merely another foreign power in the Iranian strategic imagination. It is the superpower that has shaped regional order for generations. Through alliances, sanctions, military bases, naval presence, diplomatic pressure, intelligence cooperation, and the defense of energy routes. For Washington, Iran represents a persistent challenge to the American-led order in the Middle East. For Tehran, the United States represents a strategic threat, a source of sanctions, a protector of rivals, and a power whose presence limits Iranian ambition. Neither side sees only the present. Both carry memory. The United States remembers hostage crises, attacks on partners, regional destabilization, nuclear disputes, threats to shipping, and the long pattern of confrontation. Iran remembers foreign intervention, war, sanctions, encirclement, and what it sees as Western attempts to constrain its sovereignty and influence. Memory does not excuse policy, but it explains why distrust is so durable. In diplomacy, distrust is expensive. It means every concession looks like weakness, every delay looks like deceit, every military movement looks like preparation, and every message must be decoded through suspicion. This suspicion is multiplied by the nuclear question. The nuclear issue is not just technical. It is strategic, psychological, and symbolic. Uranium enrichment levels, inspection regimes, centrifuges, breakout time, sanctions relief, verification mechanisms. These are technical matters, but behind them lies a larger fear. What would happen to the regional balance if Iran acquired a nuclear weapons capability, or if its adversaries believed it was moving too close to one? The danger is not only the weapon itself. It is the crisis created by the suspicion that the weapon may be near. Nuclear anxiety has a special power because it compresses time. When states believe a rival may be approaching a decisive threshold, patience shrinks. Diplomacy becomes harder. Military options rise in the background. Intelligence estimates become political documents. Leaders fear being accused of waiting too long. Rivals fear that delay may become defeat. In such an atmosphere, even uncertainty can become explosive. Iran's leadership understands the value and danger of thresholds. Too little pressure, and Iran is ignored or squeezed. Too much pressure, and Iran risks a devastating response. The art lies in moving close enough to the edge to force attention, but not so far that the edge disappears beneath the feet. This is not a game. It is a dangerous form of statecraft in which miscalculation can become war. But it is also how many modern confrontations are conducted, not through clean declarations, but through managed danger. Israel views this danger through the lens of survival. For Israel, Iran is not an abstract geopolitical competitor. It is a state that supports hostile actors, speaks in threatening language, develops missiles, projects influence near Israeli borders, and has been associated with the most serious long-term security concerns in Israeli doctrine. Israel's strategic culture is shaped by the belief that certain threats cannot be allowed to mature. When Israeli leaders look at Iran, they do not see only a distant state. They see a network, a missile arsenal, a nuclear question, and a regional architecture that may one day become intolerable. This creates a severe dilemma. If Israel acts, it may delay a threat but widen a conflict. If it does not act, it may feel that the threat grows. If the United States restrains Israel too strongly, Israel may fear abandonment. If Washington gives too much freedom, the United States may be pulled into escalation. If Iran responds forcefully, it risks open war. If Iran does not respond, it risks appearing weak. Every actor is trapped by credibility. In the Middle East, credibility is often treated as armor. But armor can become a cage. The Gulf states live inside this same tension, though from a different angle. Their economies, cities, airports, ports, energy infrastructure, and investment strategies depend upon stability. They are not eager for regional fire. Their power is built not only on oil and gas, but on confidence. Confidence that investors can come, flights can land, contracts can be honored, ships can move, and the future can be planned. For them, a major confrontation with Iran is not an abstract contest of prestige. It is a threat to infrastructure, diversification plans, social stability, and the very image of a secure future they have worked so hard to construct. Yet they also fear Iranian influence and capabilities. They depend, to varying degrees, on American security guarantees. But they have also learned that the United States is not always predictable, not always eager, and not always willing to carry the whole burden of regional order. This has pushed Gulf states into a more complex diplomacy, maintaining security ties with Washington, exploring channels with Tehran, deepening economic relationships with Asia, managing oil policy, and trying to avoid becoming the battlefield upon which others prove their resolve. This is one of the great shifts in the region. The Gulf states are no longer merely passive oil monarchies waiting under the American umbrella. They are increasingly active, ambitious, and pragmatic powers. They host global capital. They build futuristic cities. They buy weapons. They invest in technology, sports, infrastructure, logistics, and diplomacy. They want stability because stability is not only safety, it is brand, strategy, and wealth preservation. For them, Iran's pressure is dangerous not only because of war, but because it threatens confidence. Confidence is a fragile empire. It can take years to build and days to damage. A successful missile or drone strike against energy infrastructure does not need to destroy a country to change its risk profile. A shipping incident does not need to close a sea to alter calculations. A single moment of vulnerability can force investors, insurers, and governments to reprice the future. In this sense, Iran's power is psychological as much as material. It can ask the world a question: how secure is your security? The same question applies to markets. Markets dislike uncertainty, but they can tolerate many known risks. What they fear most is the unbounded scenario, a conflict whose limits are unclear, a retaliation whose target is unknown, a supply shock whose duration cannot be measured, a political decision that transforms a local clash into a regional crisis. Iran's strategic value comes partly from its ability to create precisely this uncertainty. It can make the world watch the next move before the next move has been made. This is why uncertainty can be more powerful than direct action. Direct action reveals itself. It has a size, a target, a damage estimate, a response pattern. Uncertainty expands in the imagination. It creates multiple possible futures at once. Will the Strait be threatened? Will tankers be targeted? Will proxies move? Will Israel strike again? Will the United States intervene? Will sanctions tighten? Will oil spike? Will inflation return? Will central banks delay rate cuts? Will voters punish governments? Will investors flee risk? One uncertain act can generate 100 defensive decisions. The genius and danger of pressure is that it spreads responsibility without always spreading clarity. A government may deny involvement. A militia may claim action. An ally may privately approve and publicly distance itself. A rival may know enough to accuse, but not enough to justify a full-scale response. Diplomats may search for channels while generals prepare options. Markets may move faster than intelligence briefings. The public may see only fragments and fill the gaps with fear. In this fog, language itself becomes a weapon. A leader's speech can escalate or calm. A phrase about red lines can lock a government into future action. A threat can deter, but also provoke. A denial can reassure or appear cynical. A promise of retaliation can satisfy domestic audiences while terrifying markets. A diplomatic statement can be designed not only for the adversary, but for allies, investors, oil traders, voters, and internal factions. In the modern crisis, every word has multiple audiences. Every audience hears a different message. Iran's leadership has long understood the theatre of endurance. Under sanctions, endurance becomes political symbolism. Under threat, survival becomes proof of resistance. Under isolation, self-reliance becomes doctrine. This does not erase suffering inside the country. Sanctions and economic strain affect real people, real businesses, real families, real futures. Nor does it mean the state is immune to pressure. But it means pressure does not always produce submission. Sometimes pressure hardens identity. Sometimes it strengthens the very factions it was meant to weaken. Sometimes it teaches a state how to live with pain and export uncertainty. This is one of the central lessons of sanctions. Sanctions are powerful instruments, but they are not magic. They can restrict revenue, limit access, complicate trade, isolate institutions, deter investment, and raise the cost of policy choices. But sanctions also produce adaptation. Smuggling networks develop, alternative buyers emerge, financial channels mutate, domestic industries adjust, political narratives intensify, populations suffer while ruling elites claim resistance. Sanctions can weaken a state, but they do not automatically transform its strategic behavior in the desired direction. In Iran's case, sanctions have shaped the economy and the state's worldview. They have made oil exports, banking access, foreign investment, and currency stability central arenas of conflict. They have also encouraged Tehran to search for partners beyond the Western system, to deepen ties where possible with states willing to resist or bypass American pressure, and to view economic survival as part of national security. This is why oil, sanctions, and diplomacy are inseparable in the Iranian question. A barrel sold, a payment channel opened, a waiver granted, a sanction enforced, a tanker tracked, each can become part of the struggle. Oil is not merely revenue for Iran, it is sovereignty, leverage, and breadth. When sanctions restrict oil, they restrict the state's ability to finance itself, support allies, manage domestic demands, and project resilience. When oil prices rise, even restricted producers may gain strategic room. When global supply fears increase, countries that need energy may become more cautious in how they confront producers. This does not give Iran unlimited freedom. But it does mean energy markets are not neutral territory. They are part of the battlefield. The psychological dimension is crucial. Iran does not need to control the whole market to influence its mood. It does not need to close a strait to make the world price the possibility of closure. It does not need to launch a massive war to make insurers, traders, and governments ask what a massive war would cost. In a system built on confidence, the ability to disturb confidence is itself a form of power. That is the art of pressure, to turn possibility into leverage. But pressure is dangerous because it can become addictive. A state that learns to gain attention through escalation may return to escalation. A rival that learns to deter through force may return to force. A market that repeatedly survives danger may become complacent until the danger grows too large. Leaders may begin to believe they can control the temperature forever. They may assume every crisis can be calibrated, every proxy restrained, every signal understood, every retaliation limited, every public contained. History offers little mercy to such confidence. Miscalculation is not always born from stupidity. Often it is born from success. A strategy works several times, so leaders believe it will work again. A red line is approached, but not crossed, so they approach it more closely. An adversary hesitates, so they mistake hesitation for weakness. A limited strike remains limited, so they believe the next one will also remain limited. A market absorbs a shock, so they believe the next shock will also be absorbed. Then one day, the same move produces a different result. This is the hidden danger in Iran's regional pressure system. It is designed to create options, flexibility, and deterrence. But the more actors are involved, the harder control becomes. A militia may act beyond instruction. A rival may respond more harshly than expected. A domestic audience may demand revenge. A military commander may interpret ambiguity as permission. An intelligence failure may misread preparation as attack. A government under political pressure may choose escalation to avoid appearing weak. In a region filled with weapons and memory, the margin for error can vanish quickly. The United States faces its own version of the pressure dilemma. American power is immense, but American attention is divided. Washington must think about Europe, China, the Indo-Pacific, domestic politics, debt, elections, alliances, defense production, border pressures, technology, competition, and public fatigue. The United States remains the central military power in the Gulf, but it no longer operates in the unquestioned atmosphere of the early post-Cold War era. Its rivals test it. Its allies doubt it. Its voters question the cost of global responsibility. Its leaders try to deter without being dragged into another long conflict. This gives Iran an opening. Not an opening to defeat America, but an opening to exploit hesitation. If Washington wants to avoid war, Tehran can test how much pressure Washington will tolerate. If Washington wants to protect shipping, Iran can raise the cost of protection. If Washington wants to reassure allies, Iran can make reassurance more expensive. If Washington wants to focus on Asia, Iran can remind it that the Middle East has not released America from history. Yet Iran must also fear American power. The United States can devastate targets, strengthen sanctions, mobilize coalitions, provide intelligence to partners, defend shipping, and strike with precision. Tehran's strategy therefore depends on a delicate balance, appear dangerous enough to deter, but not so reckless as to invite overwhelming punishment. That balance is easier to describe than to maintain. Israel's position is even sharper. Israel is smaller, closer, more exposed, and more impatient with threats it considers existential. Its leaders may calculate that waiting creates more danger than acting. Iran may calculate that Israeli action must be answered. The United States may then be forced to decide how far support extends. The Gulf may seek distance while fearing consequences. Europe may call for restraint while worrying about energy. China may call for stability while protecting its supply interests. Markets may move before any of these governments complete their statements. This is how a regional confrontation becomes a world story. Not because every state wants war, most do not. Not because escalation is inevitable, it is not. But because the structure is connected. Every actor's defensive move can look offensive to another. Every signal can be misread. Every limited action can require a limited response, and every limited response can create pressure for the next. The system does not need madness to become dangerous. It needs only fear, pride, uncertainty, and weapons. Iran's use of proxies and partners must be understood in this light. These networks give Tehran strategic depth. They allow pressure to be applied across multiple fronts. They complicate the enemy's defense. They create deniability and dispersion. They mean that a confrontation with Iran may not occur only on Iranian territory. It may unfold in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, the Gulf, the Red Sea, cyberspace, or at sea. This is not accidental. It is the construction of a regional pressure map. But such networks also create risk for Iran. Influence is not absolute control. Partners have their own interests, local pressures, ambitions, and survival instincts. The more Iran relies on a network strategy, the more it must manage actors whose actions can create consequences for Tehran itself. A proxy can be a shield. It can also become a fuse. The Red Sea disruptions in recent years have shown how quickly maritime risk can affect global trade. Attacks or threats against shipping do not need to sink the world economy to change its behaviour. They can force rerouting, raise costs, delay goods, increase insurance premiums, and remind governments that sea power is not an antique concept. The same logic applies with even greater force near the Gulf. Maritime vulnerability is one of the oldest truths of commerce. The modern world rediscovered it because it forgot that ships, unlike financial models, must pass through real water. Iran's pressure therefore sits at the intersection of old and new power. Old power, geography, sea lanes, oil, missiles, militias, ports, borders. New power, market psychology, drone technology, cyber operations, satellite surveillance, algorithmic trading, social media narratives, instant financial reaction. A crisis can now move from a radar screen to a trading screen to a voter's pocket with astonishing speed. This speed magnifies pressure. It leaves less time for correction, less time for explanation, and less time for statesmanship. Statesmanship is exactly what such moments require. But statesmanship is difficult when every actor believes it must prove resolve. Iran must prove it cannot be bullied. Israel must prove it cannot be encircled. The United States must prove it can defend order without stumbling into another war. Gulf states must prove they are secure and independent. Europe must prove it has a voice. China must prove it can be a great power without carrying the same burdens as America. Each actor performs for multiple audiences. Each audience demands strength. And strength, when poorly governed, can become escalation. The world often misunderstands restraint. It treats restraint as weakness until the absence of restraint produces disaster. In reality, restraint is one of the highest forms of power. Any state can react in anger. Not every state can absorb pressure, preserve credibility, and choose the moment of action wisely. But restraint requires confidence. Leaders who feel insecure at home often become more theatrical abroad. Governments under criticism may confuse visible action with strategic success. Public rage can narrow the space for diplomacy. Media cycles can compress decision-making. Markets can punish uncertainty faster than governments can explain policy. Iran knows this. Its adversaries know it too. That is why psychological pressure works. It is aimed not only at armies, but at political nervous systems. It asks whether leaders can remain disciplined when headlines demand performance. It asks whether alliances can remain united when costs rise. It asks whether publics can remain patient when prices climb. It asks whether financial systems can remain calm when maps grow darker. This does not make Iran the master of events. No actor is the master of events once escalation begins. That is the great lesson leaders often forget. They begin by using pressure as a tool. Then pressure creates responses. Responses create new pressures. The crisis becomes a living thing. It develops momentum. It punishes assumptions. It exposes weak communication, divided alliances, poor intelligence, domestic fragility, and the arrogance of those who believe they could choreograph danger. Iran's strategic culture has been shaped by the knowledge that survival requires endurance, depth, and leverage. It has learned to fight indirectly, negotiate under pressure, absorb punishment, and use geography as a weapon of implication. But the same strategy that gives Iran influence also places it near the edge of severe conflict. To threaten the systems on which the world depends is to gain attention. It is also to invite the world's fear. And fear, once concentrated, can become force. The relationship between Tehran, Washington, Israel, the Gulf states, and global markets is therefore not a straight line. It is a triangle, a web, a pressure chamber. Tehran acts, Washington signals, Israel calculates, Gulf capitals hedge, traders reprice, central banks watch, Europe worries, China measures supply, and ordinary citizens wait without knowing they are waiting. Then a new headline appears, and the whole system adjusts again. This is the Middle Eastern art of pressure in its modern form. It is not always the open battle. It is the shadow before the battle. It is the cost before the explosion. It is the fear before the shortage. It is the rumour before the price spike. It is the warning before the convoy. It is the sanction before the negotiation. It is the missile test before the diplomatic meeting. It is the public denial and the private message. It is power expressed through uncertainty. And uncertainty, in our age, may be the most efficient weapon of all, for uncertainty does not require occupation. It does not require victory parades. It does not require total mobilization. It requires only enough credibility to make others imagine the damage. A state that can make markets imagine disruption has already entered the market. A state that can make navies deploy has already imposed cost. A state that can make investors hesitate has already influenced capital. A state that can make voters fear inflation has already touched domestic politics far beyond its borders. Yet uncertainty is a fire that can burn the hand that carries it. Iran may use fear as leverage, but fear may also create coalitions against it. It may raise oil prices, but it may also accelerate efforts to reduce dependency. It may deter attack, but it may also convince adversaries that delay is more dangerous than action. It may strengthen domestic narratives of resistance, but it may worsen economic pain. It may project power, but it may deepen isolation. Strategy is never free. Every instrument has a price. This is why the Iranian question remains so difficult. There is no clean answer. There is pressure and counter-pressure, deterrence and provocation, sanctions and adaptation, diplomacy and distrust, military planning and fear of war, regional ambition and domestic strain, oil revenue and economic fragility, nuclear anxiety and negotiation, proxy influence and loss of control. Each piece is connected to the others. Pull one thread and the fabric shifts. A serious world must therefore think in systems, not slogans. It must ask not only what Iran did, but what Iran believes it can gain. Not only what America threatens, but what America is willing to sustain. Not only what Israel fears, but what Israel may do if fear hardens into urgency. Not only what Gulf states say publicly, but what they must protect privately. Not only what oil costs today, but what risk markets are beginning to price into tomorrow. Not only whether war is likely, but whether the conditions for accidental escalation are being assembled. The greatest danger may not be a deliberate decision for full war. The greatest danger may be a chain of limited decisions that no one knows how to stop. One limited strike. One calibrated response, one misread signal, one domestic audience demanding strength, one commander acting faster than diplomacy, one market panic that pressures governments, one leader convinced that backing down is more dangerous than moving forward. Many wars have entered history not as master plans, but as sequences of decisions that seem manageable at the time. Iran's art of pressure exists inside this danger. It is effective because it exploits the fears of a connected world. It is dangerous because a connected world can transmit shock faster than leaders can contain it. It is rational in design, but it operates in a region where emotion, memory, ideology, and domestic politics can overwhelm rational design. It is powerful because it uses uncertainty, It is perilous because uncertainty cannot always be recalled. And this brings us back to the wider theme. The Middle East is not only a region of oil and armies, it is a theatre where the modern world discovers how vulnerable its own confidence has become. Iran has learned to press upon that confidence. It presses through missiles, proxies, sanctions endurance, nuclear ambiguity, maritime proximity, regional influence, and psychological force. It presses not because it can control everything, but because it knows no one else can control everything either. That is the essence of pressure, to make the powerful feel the limits of their power. The United States can strike, but it must ask what follows. Israel can act, but it must ask how wide the fire spreads. Gulf states can invest in the future, but they must ask whether the skies and seas remain safe. Europe can speak of diplomacy, but it must ask how much energy pain its people will endure. China can call for stability, but it must ask whether trade routes can be trusted. Markets can price risk, but they must ask whether risk has been priced enough. And ordinary citizens, though they may not know the names of straits, militias, sanctions, or enrichment levels, will eventually ask why life has become more expensive again. This is how Iran reaches beyond Iran, not by conquering the world, but by disturbing the nerves of the world, not by controlling the global economy, but by reminding it that parts of its foundation pass near Iranian power. Not by matching every rival, but by making every rival calculate. The art of pressure is the art of making others pay attention. But attention is not victory. Fear is not strategy by itself. Pressure can open doors, but it can also close exits. Iran's leaders know this, and so do their rivals. The question is whether all actors can continue to manage danger without becoming prisoners of the danger they have managed. For the world now stands in a familiar but unforgiving position. It sees the smoke. It feels the heat. It hears the language of restraint and retaliation, negotiation and warning, sovereignty and security, deterrence and revenge. It watches markets move before diplomats finish speak on. It watches oil respond to rumours of peace and threats of fire. It watches governments insist they seek stability while preparing for instability. And beneath it all lies the same truth. Fear has become a currency. Iran knows how to spend it. Markets know how to price it. Governments know how to deny it until they cannot. And citizens know how to feel it when it enters their lives through fuel, food, electricity, inflation, and uncertainty. The first block taught us that the Middle East is a pressure point of the global economy. This second block reveals why Iran is one of the principal hands pressing upon that point. Not the only hand. Not an omnipotent hand. But a deliberate one, trained by history, hardened by sanctions, armed with missiles, connected through regional networks, and skilled in the politics of uncertainty. The next question is unavoidable. If Iran's pressure works partly because the world still depends on oil, shipping, and fragile routes, then how exactly does fear become price? How does a threat in the Gulf become a number on a screen? How does a maritime risk become inflation? How does a tanker route become a central bank problem? To answer that, we must go from Tehran's strategy to the bloodstream of the modern economy. We must go from pressure to price. We must enter the world of oil, shipping, and the price of fear. Oil is not merely a substance drawn from the earth. It is motion made liquid. It is the stored force that moves armies, aircraft, ships, factories, tractors, freight trucks, mining equipment, emergency services, and the unseen machinery of daily life. It enters the economy not as one product among many, but as a cost inside many products. It is burned directly in engines, refined into fuels, transformed into petrochemicals, embedded in transport, tied to fertilizers, linked to plastics, and woven into the industrial metabolism of the modern world. This is why oil remains the bloodstream of the global economy. Not because humanity lacks imagination. Not because the energy transition is imaginary. Not because electricity, nuclear power, solar power, wind power, batteries, and new technologies are unimportant. They are important. But no serious civilization confuses the promise of tomorrow with the dependency of today. A world may speak the language of decarbonisation and still tremble when tankers hesitate near the Gulf. A government may announce a future of clean energy and still fear the price of diesel, jet fuel, liquefied natural gas and fertiliser. A central bank may speak in the polished vocabulary of monetary policy and still watch the oil market like a sailor watching the weather before battle. The price of oil is not only the price of energy, it is the price of speed, it is the price of distance, it is the price of moving food from field to city, goods from port to warehouse, people from home to work, soldiers from base to theatre, and materials from mine to factory. When oil rises, the world does not pay in one place. It pays everywhere, slowly at first, then suddenly. Transport costs rise, shipping costs rise, agricultural input costs rise, production costs rise. Electricity costs may rise, where fuel is used for generation. Consumers begin to feel a pressure they cannot easily explain, but cannot ignore. This is why the Middle East matters to markets before the battlefield reaches its worst hour. Markets understand dependency. They understand routes. They understand choke points. They understand that a barrel of oil is not useful merely because it exists underground. It must be extracted, processed, loaded, insured, shipped, delivered, refined, financed, and consumed. Each step requires confidence. Each step can be disturbed. And when confidence breaks, the market does not wait for official confirmation. It reprices danger. The Strait of Hormuz is the clearest example. At its narrowest point, it is only about 29 nautical miles wide, with 2-mile-wide shipping channels in each direction and a 2-mile buffer zone between them. Yet through this narrow passage, an average of about 20 million barrels per day of crude oil and oil products moved in 2025, around 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade. The International Energy Agency states that about 80% of that oil and product flow was destined for Asia. It also estimates that alternative crude export capacity outside the strait is limited to roughly 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day through Saudi and Emirati routes. These numbers are not decorative. They are the architecture of vulnerability. If nearly 20 million barrels a day depend on a narrow maritime corridor, and only a fraction can be redirected quickly, then the market does not need a full and permanent closure to become afraid. It only needs credible danger. A mine warning, a drone threat, a naval confrontation, a tanker incident, an insurance withdrawal, a military alert, a sanctions shock, or even language suggesting possible disruption can create a premium in the price. That premium is not the price of oil already lost. It is the price of oil that might be lost. This is called risk. But the word is too calm for what it means. Risk is fear translated into money. Risk is uncertainty converted into a number. Risk is the market saying the physical barrel may still be moving, but the assumption behind its movement has weakened. The old price was based on the belief that the route would remain open, the ship would be insured, the cargo would arrive, the refinery would receive supply, the government would not panic, and the next morning would resemble the last. Once those beliefs are questioned, the old price no longer holds. The price of fear enters through several doors at once. First, it enters through crude oil futures. Traders buy protection against higher prices. Consumers hedge. Producers adjust. Speculators enter. Funds reposition. Algorithms respond to headlines faster than parliaments can debate them. Second, fear enters through physical markets. Buyers seek cargoes from safer routes. Refiners worry about grades of crude they can no longer easily replace. Shipping schedules become uncertain. Third, fear enters through insurance. If a vessel must cross a danger zone, the cost of covering that voyage rises. Fourth, fear enters through freight. Longer routes mean more fuel, more time, fewer available ships, and higher rates. Fifth, fear enters through currencies, bonds, equities, and inflation expectations. This is how a threat becomes a price, not by magic, by calculation, by hedging, by caution, by every company, government, bank, and trader trying to avoid being the last to understand the danger. Shipping is the body of globalization. Without it, globalization becomes a speech. More than goods, shipping carries the credibility of the modern economic order. It tells factories that inputs will arrive. It tells retailers that shelves will be filled. It tells energy importers that fuel will come. It tells consumers that distance has been conquered. But shipping is not abstract. Ships must pass through choke points. They must enter canals. They must cross narrow seas. They must rely on ports, crews, insurance, naval protection, weather, law and peace. The US Energy Information Administration estimated that in the first half of 2025, total world petroleum and other liquid supply was about 104.4 million barrels per day, and roughly 79.8 million barrels per day, about 76% travelled by sea. Oil tankers accounted for 28% of the world's shipping by deadweight tonnage in 2024, according to UNCTAD data cited by the EIA. This means that the global oil market is not simply an energy market. It is a maritime market. The sea is not a background. The sea is part of the price. If ships move normally, the world forgets them. If ships stop moving, the world remembers everything at once. The Middle East contains several of the most sensitive maritime arteries on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, the Gulf of Oman, the Persian Gulf. Each has its own geography, politics, military pressures, and commercial importance. Together, they form a network through which energy, containers, fertilizers, chemicals, metals, and manufactured goods move between Asia, Europe, Africa, and the wider world. The recent Red Sea crisis already gave the world a lesson in how maritime pressure spreads. The World Bank noted that the Red Sea crisis disrupted global trade and maritime transport, and that before the crisis, the Suez Canal and Bab el-Mandeb route carried about 30% of world container traffic. By late 2024, vessel traffic through that route had fallen sharply as many ships avoided the area. The point is not that the Red Sea and Hormuz are the same. They are not. The point is that shipping disruption is no longer theoretical. The world has already seen how quickly a threat to vessels can reroute commerce, raise costs, delay cargoes, and expose the fragility of just-in-time trade. When ships reroute around the Cape of Good Hope instead of passing through the Red Sea and Suez, the journey between Asia and Europe can add thousands of nautical miles, extra days at sea, more fuel burn, tighter vessel availability, and higher freight rates. Even before a consumer knows why, the cost begins moving through the chain. A container delayed at sea becomes inventory stress. Inventory stress becomes lost sales or higher costs. Higher costs become prices. Prices become inflation. Inflation becomes politics. Hormuz is different because oil and gas sit at its centre. The IEA says almost 20 million barrels per day of oil and oil products were exported through the strait in 2025, including about 14.95 million barrels per day of crude and condensates, and about 4.93 million barrels per day of oil products. Saudi Arabia alone accounted for about 6.23 million barrels per day of total oil and product flows through Hormuz, Iraq about 3.63 million, the UAE about 3.24 million, Iran about 2.41 million, Kuwait about 2.37 million, Qatar about 1.43 million, and Bahrain about 0.21 million. These figures explain why markets fear escalation before escalation reaches its final form. A missile does not need to strike every tanker. A crisis does not need to stop every barrel. The market understands concentration. It sees that multiple producers, multiple cargoes, multiple refineries, multiple economies, and much of Asia's energy security are tied to a narrow corridor. It sees that China, India, Japan, South Korea, and other Asian economies depend heavily on Gulf energy flows. It sees that if this route becomes unreliable, the question is not merely price. The question is allocation. Allocation is the dark word behind every supply shock. Who gets the cargo? At what price? Under what insurance? From which alternative supplier? With what delay? Paid in which currency? Protected by whose navy? Guaranteed by whose diplomacy? In calm times, markets allocate through price. In severe crises, governments intervene. Strategic reserves are released. Export controls appear. Subsidies are debated. Emergency meetings are called. Diplomats pressure producers. Central banks revise forecasts. The language of free markets begins to share the stage with the language of national survival. This is where oil becomes political power again. The oil market contains physical supply, but also spare capacity. Spare capacity is the ability to produce more oil quickly when the world needs it. It is a buffer against shock. But the IEA warns that a major disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could also make unavailable much of the world's spare crude production capacity, because that spare capacity is concentrated mainly in Saudi Arabia and would itself depend on export routes affected by the crisis. The agency estimated that world spare crude production capacity, excluding countries under sanctions, was above 4 million barrels per day in the fourth quarter of 2025. This is a crucial point. If a crisis blocks not only current flows, but also the spare capacity needed to calm the market, then the shock becomes more dangerous. It is like discovering during a fire that the emergency exit also passes through the flames. The market does not merely ask how much oil is lost today, it asks who can replace it tomorrow. If the answer is uncertain, fear rises. Natural gas adds another layer. The Strait of Hormuz is not only about crude oil. The IEA states that about 93% of Qatar's LNG exports and 96% of the UAE's LNG exports transited through the strait in 2025, representing almost 1/5 of global LNG trade. It also says there are no alternative routes to bring these LNG volumes to market. This matters because LNG is no longer a regional fuel. It is a global balancing mechanism. Europe learned this after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when pipeline gas dependence became a strategic vulnerability and LNG became part of the emergency solution. Asia has long depended on LNG for power generation and industry. A Hormuz shock therefore threatens not only oil markets, but gas markets, electricity prices, industrial costs, and winter security. A disruption to LNG flows would not be easily repaired by rerouting. Oil can sometimes be redirected through pipelines, different ports, or alternative crude grades. LNG is more rigid. It requires liquefaction terminals, specialized tankers, receiving terminals, regasification capacity, and long-term contracts. The IEA estimates that a loss of LNG flows through Hormuz would remove over 300 million cubic meters per day from the global market, and that such volumes could not be replaced at short notice because other LNG plants are already running close to capacity. This is why energy shocks multiply. Oil shock becomes transport shock. Gas shock becomes electricity shock. Electricity shock becomes industrial shock. Fertilizer shock becomes food shock. Shipping shock becomes supply chain shock. None of these channels moves in isolation. They reinforce one another. Fertilizer is another hidden battlefield. The IEA reports that more than 30% of global urea trade moves through the Strait of Hormuz, along with about 20% of ammonia and phosphate trade. UNCTAD has warned that higher energy, fertilizer, transport, bunker fuel and insurance costs can raise food costs and intensify cost of living pressures, especially for vulnerable countries. This is the part of geopolitics that rarely fits neatly into television headlines. The ordinary viewer sees oil, war, sanctions and ships. But the farmer sees fertilizer. The food importer sees currency pressure. The poor household sees bread, rice, cooking oil, and transport rising together. Food inflation is politically explosive because it touches dignity. Fuel inflation angers. Food inflation frightens. When people believe the basics are slipping beyond reach, politics changes character. It becomes less patient, less institutional, more emotional, more open to extremes. Governments know this. That is why an energy shock is never just an energy shock. It is a test of the social contract. Central banks fear energy shocks because they are difficult to control. A central bank can raise interest rates to cool demand. It can make borrowing more expensive. It can slow credit, housing, investment and consumption. But it cannot print oil. It cannot open a strait. It cannot escort tankers. It cannot produce LNG. It cannot mine fertilizers. It cannot negotiate with missiles. Monetary policy can suppress demand after a shock, but it cannot easily create supply. This is why energy inflation is so dangerous. It can raise prices while weakening growth. It can make people poorer while forcing central banks to remain strict. It can produce the bitter combination of inflation pressure and economic slowdown. The European Central Bank recently described a new energy shock pushing consumer prices higher, noting that euro area headline inflation rose to 3% in April 2026, driven by a 10.9% increase in energy prices, even while inflation excluding energy fell to 2.2%. The ECB warned that higher consumer prices and uncertainty can reduce real incomes and hurt domestic demand. These figures reveal the trap. Even when underlying inflation is cooling, energy can reawaken headline inflation. Even when consumers hope the worst is over, geopolitics can return through the bill. This is the nightmare of central bankers. The second round. First, oil rises. Then fuel and energy prices rise. Then transport and production costs rise. Then companies raise prices. Then workers demand higher wages. Then households expect future inflation. Then businesses price in those expectations. Then inflation becomes not only a shock, but a habit. Central banks fight not only prices, but psychology. And psychology, once infected, is difficult to cure. Governments fear the same chain for political reasons. If they subsidize energy broadly, they may protect households in the short term but worsen public debt and weaken incentives to conserve. If they do not subsidize, public anger may rise. If they cut taxes on fuel, they lose revenue. If they impose price controls, shortages may appear. If they blame foreign events, voters may not care. If they raise interest rates through central banks, mortgages and credit become painful. If they allow inflation to run, savings and wages lose value. There is no clean choice, only a hierarchy of damage. This is why the price of fear matters before the full supply loss arrives. The expectation of higher oil can itself influence behavior. Airlines hedge fuel. Shipping firms adjust routes. Importers accelerate purchases. Refiners secure cargoes. Traders bid up futures. Governments consider reserves. Consumers may begin to expect higher prices. In the modern economy, expectation is an economic force. It pulls the future into the present. Oil prices also influence currencies. Energy importers may see trade balances worsen when oil rises. They need more dollars to buy the same fuel. Their currencies can weaken, making imported goods more expensive. Developing economies with dollar-denominated debt face another pressure. Higher import bills, weaker currency, higher debt service, and less fiscal space. UNCTAD warned that the current shock comes as many developing economies already struggle to service debt and have limited capacity to absorb new price shocks. This is how a crisis near Iran becomes a crisis in countries that have no role in the conflict. A nation may not fire a missile, impose a sanction, host a base, or own a tanker. It may still pay. It pays through imported fuel, expensive fertilizer, weaker currency, higher borrowing costs, and public anger. This is the injustice of interconnected vulnerability. Responsibility and exposure are not equally distributed. Markets know this faster than politics admits it. A market is not wise in the moral sense. It can be greedy, panicked, short-sighted, and brutal. But it is sensitive. It feels pressure quickly. It reacts to signals. It connects distant facts through price. When oil jumps, airline stocks may fall. Shipping companies may rise or suffer depending on exposure. Chemical producers may worry. Emerging market currencies may weaken. Inflation-linked bonds may move. Central bank expectations may shift. Equity valuations may compress if interest rate cuts are delayed. Credit spreads may widen if investors fear weaker growth. A regional crisis becomes a portfolio event. This is why politicians often appear behind the curve. Markets react to probability. Politicians speak after verification. Traders do not need certainty. Governments often do. By the time a government explains what has happened, prices may already have moved. By the time a central bank discusses the outlook, consumers may already have seen fuel costs rise. By the time diplomats call for calm, shipping firms may already have changed routes. In a crisis, markets are not waiting for speeches. They are voting with money. There is a cruel efficiency in this. The market does not wait for the ordinary person to understand. It simply passes the cost along. The tanker insurer charges more. The ship operator charges more. The fuel buyer pays more. The manufacturer pays more. The retailer pays more. The consumer pays more. At every stage, someone says, "We had no choice." And perhaps each individual actor is right. But the result is that a geopolitical risk becomes a social burden. The phrase risk premium sounds technical, almost harmless. It is not. A risk premium is the surcharge of danger. It is the added price the world pays because peace is less certain than yesterday. It appears in oil, gas, freight, insurance, interest rates, credit, and sometimes food. It is invisible on the receipt, but present in the total. No supermarket bill says, "Geopolitical risk premium added." No electricity bill says, "Maritime insecurity surcharge." No loan statement says, "Middle East uncertainty adjustment." But the cost is there. Oil is especially powerful because it is priced globally. A barrel disturbed in one region affects benchmarks watched everywhere. Even countries that import little directly from the Gulf can face higher prices because the market price is global. Europe may receive a small share of crude flows through Hormuz compared with Asia, but it cannot escape the price signal. The IEA notes that only around 4% of the region's crude flows through the Strait were routed into Europe in 2025. Yet the impact of disruption would be global because pricing reacts immediately. This is the meaning of integration. Direct exposure is not the only exposure. Price exposure is enough. Consider the chain from crude to gasoline. Crude oil rises. Refinery margins may change depending on capacity and product demand. Gasoline and diesel wholesale prices respond. Retail prices adjust with taxes, distribution costs, and competition. Consumers see the number at the pump. They reduce spending elsewhere or demand higher wages. Businesses with delivery fleets raise prices. Public transportation systems face higher costs. Farmers pay more for diesel. Airlines pay more for jet fuel. Governments face pressure to intervene. In every case, oil has entered the political bloodstream. Now consider the chain from natural gas to food. LNG prices rise. Power generation costs may rise in gas-dependent systems. Fertilizer production becomes more expensive because natural gas is a major input for ammonia. Fertilizer prices rise. Farmers either pay more or use less. Crop yields may be affected. Food prices rise. Poor countries face higher import bills. Governments subsidize bread or risk unrest. Debt rises. Currency pressure worsens. What began as a gas market shock becomes a food security issue. Now, consider shipping. Insurance premiums rise in a danger zone. Ships avoid a route. Longer voyages consume more fuel. More ships are tied up for longer periods. Effective global shipping capacity falls. Freight rates rise. Delivery times stretch. Inventories become uncertain. Manufacturers and retailers adjust. Some costs are absorbed. Many are passed on. Consumers pay. Again, the path is not immediate, but it is real. This is why modern inflation can return through geopolitics after people believe it has been defeated. Inflation is not a single enemy. It is a family of pressures. Demand inflation, supply inflation, wage inflation, energy inflation, currency inflation, food inflation, expectations-driven inflation. Each has different causes and different cures. A central bank may defeat one channel and then face another. A government may celebrate falling core inflation only to be struck by energy. A household may hear that inflation is improving while still paying more for fuel and groceries. The public does not live inside statistical categories. It lives inside total cost. There is also a memory problem. After a period of high inflation, societies become sensitive. Even a moderate new shock can have a larger psychological effect because people remember the previous pain. They no longer believe assurances easily. They suspect that prices will rise again and never fully come down. Businesses become quicker to protect margins. Workers become quicker to demand compensation. Governments become quicker to subsidize. Central banks become quicker to warn. The inflation wound heals slowly. This is why the Middle East carries such influence over economic policy. It can alter not only supply, but trust. Trust that inflation is under control. Trust that interest rates will fall. Trust that governments can protect living standards. Trust that globalization will deliver goods cheaply. Trust that energy transition will be orderly. Trust that war will remain contained. Trust that markets know how to price danger. When trust weakens, the economy changes even before the physical shortage is severe. The oil market is also shaped by inventories. Commercial stocks, strategic reserves, floating storage, refinery stocks, and spare capacity all matter. They provide time. Time is the most precious commodity in a crisis. If reserves are sufficient, governments can calm markets temporarily. If stocks are low, fear rises. If reserves are used, the market asks how long they can last. If they are not used, the market asks whether governments are saving them for worse. Every buffer is also a message. Strategic petroleum reserves are not merely barrels in storage. They are political instruments. They tell the market that governments can intervene. But they cannot replace a major, prolonged disruption indefinitely. A reserve can buy weeks or months. It cannot redesign geography. It cannot create spare tankers. It cannot make Qatar's LNG leave without a route. It cannot make every refinery process a different crude overnight. It can soften the first blow. It cannot abolish the war. This is why physical details matter. Not all oil is identical. Crude grades differ by density and sulfur content. Refineries are configured for certain types of crude. A lost barrel from one region cannot always be replaced perfectly by a barrel from another. Logistics matter. Contracts matter. Port capacity matters. Pipeline capacity matters. Sanctions matter. Finance matters. A headline may say, oil supply, but the market asks, what grade, where, when, insured by whom, shipped on what vessel, paid through which bank, refined in which facility, delivered to which buyer. The more one studies oil, the less abstract it becomes. It is not a number floating on a screen. It is steel, water, labour, law, weather, war risk, refinery chemistry, storage tanks, customs paperwork, credit letters, naval patrols, and political permission. Iran's relevance lies in this physical reality. Iran does not need to dominate the world economy to disturb it. It sits near a route through which enough energy passes to affect global prices. It has missiles and drones. It has regional partners. It has experience under sanctions. It understands symbolic moves, calibrated threats, and the psychological leverage of uncertainty. It knows that markets do not require certainty to move. They require credible doubt. Yet, the same reality constrains Iran. A severe disruption of Hormuz would not punish only its enemies. It would also threaten Iran's own exports, its neighbours, Asian buyers, and partners that prefer stability. It could provoke military response, deepen isolation, and accelerate efforts to bypass or reduce dependence on Iranian adjacent routes. The strait is leveraged because it is vital, but precisely because it is vital, threatening it too severely invites danger. This is why much of the struggle occurs in signals, pressure, partial disruption, and fear rather than total closure. The world often speaks of escalation as if it were a staircase. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. But in markets, escalation is more like weather pressure. The air changes before the storm. Instruments detect movement before the eye sees it. Traders price probability. Governments prepare scenarios. Ships alter behaviour. Central banks adjust language. Insurance desks reprice voyages. The public may not notice until later, but by then, the atmosphere has already shifted. The price of fear can also be self-reinforcing. If oil rises sharply, inflation expectations rise. If inflation expectations rise, central banks may keep rates higher. If rates stay higher, growth slows. If growth slows, markets become nervous. If markets become nervous, investors seek safety. If investors seek safety, emerging markets may face capital outflows. If emerging markets weaken, political instability may rise. Instability can create more risk. The original oil shock becomes a wider financial tremor. Debt makes this more dangerous. The world is not facing energy risk from a position of perfect fiscal strength. Many governments carry heavy debt burdens. Households in many countries have endured years of higher prices and higher borrowing costs. Businesses have refinanced at higher rates. Public budgets are strained by defence spending, ageing populations, infrastructure needs, climate adaptation, subsidies, and political promises. A new energy shock does not strike a fresh body, it strikes a tired one. This is why the phrase higher for longer became so politically important in monetary policy. If energy shocks keep inflation above target, central banks may delay rate cuts or even tighten policy. That means mortgages stay painful, business loans stay expensive, government debt service remains heavy, asset prices adjust, investment decisions are postponed. The cost of geopolitics appears not only at the pump, but in the bank account, the mortgage payment, the public budget, and the unemployment risk. The market often understands this in layers. First layer, oil price rises. Second layer, inflation expectations rise. Third layer, interest rate expectations shift. Fourth layer, equity valuations fall because future profits are discounted at higher rates. Fifth layer, credit risk rises because companies face higher costs and weaker demand. Sixth layer, political risk rises because voters are angry. Seventh layer, policy risk rises because governments intervene under pressure. A barrel of oil becomes a chain of repricing. This is why energy shocks frighten central banks more than ordinary commodity fluctuations. Energy is everywhere. It enters calculations directly and indirectly. It is visible to households. It changes expectations. It can arrive suddenly from events no central bank controls. It can force monetary authorities into the ugly position of tightening against a supply shock, knowing that higher rates will not produce more oil, but may be necessary to prevent inflation psychology from escaping. And once again, the ordinary person experiences all of this without the vocabulary. They do not say a risk premium has entered the Brent curve. They say, yeah, everything feels expensive again. They do not say central bank reaction functions have shifted. They say, why is my loan still so costly? They do not say maritime disruption has tightened freight capacity. They say, why did this product become more expensive? They do not say fertilizer markets are exposed to Gulf shipping. They say food prices keep rising. This is the democratic brutality of inflation. It translates elite failure, distant conflict, and structural fragility into everyday frustration. It does not ask whether one follows geopolitics. It arrives anyway. The great danger for modern societies is that they have become skilled at consuming stability and poor at understanding its sources. Cheap shipping, affordable energy, open sea lanes, functioning insurance, credible central banks, disciplined governments, and restrained military powers are not natural conditions. They are achievements. They require maintenance. They require deterrence, diplomacy, infrastructure, reserves, alliances, and humility. When a society forgets this, it begins to believe that prices are low because the world is naturally peaceful. Then the world reminds it otherwise. Oil, shipping, and inflation are the grammar of that reminder. There is no need for hysteria. The world has buffers. Producers have incentives to sell. Consumers adapt. Governments coordinate. Markets sometimes overreact. Technologies improve. Demand can fall when prices rise. Strategic reserves exist. Alternative supplies can emerge. Not every crisis becomes a disaster. But serious analysis must distinguish resilience from immunity. A system that survives shocks is not a system that cannot break. It may simply be a system whose breaking point has not yet been reached. The price of fear is therefore both signal and symptom. It signals danger before full damage arrives. It is also a symptom of deeper fragility. Concentrated roots, limited alternatives, high debt, inflation memory, political distrust, and an economy still dependent on physical flows it often pretends are invisible. In this world, oil is not yesterday's story. Shipping is not a technical footnote. Insurance is not boring. Fertilizer is not separate from war. Inflation is not merely a central bank chart. These are the cables connecting geopolitics to life. Cut enough of them, and the lights of prosperity begin to flicker. This is why Iran matters to markets. Not because Iran controls everything. It does not. Not because every threat becomes reality. It does not. But because Iran operates near the machinery through which fear becomes price. It can pressure the root. It can influence regional actors. It can create uncertainty around escalation. It can force navies, insurers, traders, governments, and central banks to consider scenarios they would rather ignore. And in markets, what must be considered must often be priced. That is the central truth of this block. Oil is the bloodstream. Shipping is the circulation. Insurance is the nervous caution of commerce. Central banks are the physicians trying to prevent fever from becoming disease. Governments are the anxious guardians of public patience. Iran is one of the actors capable of raising the temperature near a critical artery. And the ordinary citizen, far from the strait and far from the war room, is the one who eventually feels the heat. The old world understood siege in physical terms. A city was surrounded, food became scarce, prices rose, fear spread. The modern world experiences siege differently. The routes remain on maps. The ports still exist. The markets still open. The screens still glow. But costs rise, delays spread, confidence weakens, and political patience narrows. It is not always a siege of walls. It is a siege of assumptions. And assumptions are the true infrastructure of modern life. The assumption that oil will flow, that LNG will ship, that food inputs will arrive, that insurance will cover voyages, that central banks will cut rates, that inflation will continue falling, that governments can absorb shocks, that voters will remain patient, that rivals will calculate rationally, that no one will misread the signal, that the fire can be contained. But history is not kind to civilizations that mistake assumptions for guarantees. Oil, shipping, and the price of fear show us the world as it truly is: advanced, wealthy, connected, and vulnerable. A world of satellites and tankers, algorithms and choke points, central banks and sea lanes, artificial intelligence and diesel engines, financial derivatives and physical barrels. A world that dreams in digital language but still depends on steel hulls moving through dangerous waters. A world where a narrow passage near Iran can unsettle inflation expectations in Europe, food costs in Africa, energy security in Asia, and political stability in countries that never imagined themselves part of the story. The fire beneath the markets is not always visible. It burns under contracts, routes, expectations and prices. It burns under speeches about growth and forecasts about inflation. It burns under the confidence that tomorrow will be manageable because yesterday was survived. But when oil rises, ships reroute, insurers hesitate, central banks warn, and citizens pay more, the fire breaks through the surface. Then the world remembers what it should never have forgotten. Finance is not separate from geography. Inflation is not separate from war. Markets are not separate from power. And peace is not separate from price. There comes a moment in every great crisis when the world discovers that power is not the same as control. A nation may possess aircraft carriers, missiles, intelligence networks, financial sanctions, alliances, bases, satellites, and diplomatic reach. It may command the language of order. It may write the rules of markets. It may patrol the seas. It may summon ministers, warn enemies, reassure partners, and move fleets across oceans. But once the fire begins to spread through a region as combustible as the Middle East, even the strongest power on earth must face the old truth. Power can shape events, but it cannot fully own them. This is the lesson of America in the Middle East. The United States remains the central external military power in the region. It remains the protector of key sea lanes, the principal security partner for several Gulf states, the strongest ally of Israel, and the only power with the military reach to respond quickly across air, sea, and land. Yet America is also an exhausted manager of global order. It is not exhausted because it is weak. It is exhausted because its responsibilities have multiplied faster than its political patience. It must think of the Middle East, Europe, China, the Indo-Pacific, debt, elections, inflation, immigration, public anger, industrial capacity, military readiness, and a population increasingly suspicious of foreign entanglements. This is the contradiction at the heart of American power. The world still expects America to protect the arteries of globalization. Many allies still depend upon American deterrence. Markets still look to Washington when shipping lanes are threatened. Yet the American public has lived through decades of Middle Eastern wars, interventions, promises, withdrawals, surges, and disappointments. It has heard too many confident speeches before uncertain outcomes. It has watched treasure spent, lives lost, alliances strained, enemies adapt, and domestic needs neglected. So, when a new crisis rises from the Gulf, America does not enter it as a fresh empire. It enters it as a superpower with memory. Memory matters. It disciplines, but it also hesitates. It warns leaders not to stumble into another war. It warns them that in the Middle East, victory declared too early can become burden prolonged too long. It warns them that striking is easier than stabilizing, that deterrence is easier than reconstruction, that military superiority does not always produce political settlement. But memory can also embolden adversaries if they mistake caution for retreat. This is the American dilemma. How to deter without overcommitting, how to reassure without being dragged, how to punish without inflaming, how to lead without appearing trapped by its own leadership. Iran understands this dilemma. So does Israel. So do the Gulf states. So does China. So does Europe. Everyone reads America, not only by what it can do, but by what it is willing to sustain. A superpower is measured not only by capability, but by endurance. The United States can strike many targets. The harder question is whether it can manage the consequences after the strike. It can escort shipping. The harder question is whether it can keep the route politically, militarily, and economically secure if the danger becomes prolonged. It can impose sanctions. The harder question is whether sanctions produce strategy or merely punishment. It can convene allies. The harder question is whether those allies will accept the cost. The Gulf reveals this tension clearly. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman do not look at Iran as an abstraction. They live beside the risk. Their ports, airports, desalination plants, refineries, pipelines, financial districts, LNG terminals, tourism projects, sovereign wealth strategies, and national visions sit within range of regional escalation. They do not have the luxury of theatrical analysis. For them, a crisis is not merely a matter of prestige. It can affect insurance, aviation, foreign investment, hotel occupancy, energy infrastructure, shipping schedules, public confidence, and the credibility of their future. These states need American power, but they also fear being consumed by American decisions. They want protection, but not necessarily provocation. They want deterrence, but not regional war. They want Iran contained, but not chaos at their borders. They want oil to command value, but not panic. They want relations with Washington, but also commercial ties with China, energy ties with Asia, diplomatic channels with Tehran, and enough flexibility to survive whichever great power loses patience first. This is why Gulf diplomacy has become more complex, more pragmatic, and more independent than the old stereotypes allow. The Gulf states are not merely oil fields with flags. They are political machines managing wealth, vulnerability, ambition, and fear. Saudi Arabia wants transformation, investment, technology, and global status. The UAE wants to remain a logistics, finance, aviation, energy, and technology hub. Qatar is a major LNG power and diplomatic broker. Kuwait and Bahrain sit inside a sensitive security architecture. Oman has long valued mediation and balance. Each state has a different risk appetite, but all understand the same fact. Confidence is their strategic asset. A city of glass towers, airports, ports, and foreign capital is not defended only by weapons. It is defended by the belief that the future is safe enough to invest in. Iran's pressure threatens that belief. A drone, missile, shipping incident, or threat to energy infrastructure does not need to destroy the Gulf to frighten capital. Investors are forward-looking. Insurers are forward-looking. Airlines are forward-looking. Shipping companies are forward-looking. If the region begins to look less predictable, money asks for compensation, delay, or distance. In that sense, Iran's regional strategy is not only military, it is aimed at the confidence architecture of its rivals. But Iran also faces the limits of pressure. The Gulf is not defenseless. The United States maintains regional military reach. Gulf states have invested heavily in air defense, surveillance, infrastructure protection, diplomacy, and redundancy. Israel possesses advanced military and intelligence capabilities. European states remain economically exposed and diplomatically active. China has a strong interest in stable energy flows. If Iran pushes too far, it may unite actors who otherwise disagree. Pressure is useful when it divides opponents. It is dangerous when it organizes them. This is where Israel enters the story with a different urgency. Israel does not view Iran as a distant market risk. It views Iran as a strategic threat with military, ideological, nuclear, and regional dimensions. Israeli security doctrine has long been shaped by a harsh principle. Threats judged existential must not be allowed to mature beyond reach. This does not mean every Israeli action is inevitable or without controversy. It means that Israeli leaders often operate under a shorter clock than outside powers prefer. What Washington may see as a crisis to manage, Israel may see as a threat to prevent. That difference in time horizon is dangerous. America often wants escalation control. Israel often wants threat reduction. The Gulf wants stability. Europe wants de-escalation and energy security. China wants continuity of trade. Iran wants deterrence, survival, and regional leverage. Each actor uses the same words: security, stability, restraint, sovereignty, deterrence, but often means different things by them. For Israel, deterrence means proving that enemies cannot build unbearable pressure around it. For Iran, deterrence means proving that attacks against it will carry regional costs. For the United States, deterrence means preventing a wider war while protecting allies and sea lanes. For Gulf states, deterrence means preventing attacks on infrastructure without becoming the battlefield. For Europe, deterrence often means preventing a shock that its economies and voters cannot absorb. For China, deterrence means preventing instability that threatens energy flows and trade. The tragedy is that all may claim to seek stability while taking actions that others interpret as escalation. This is the machinery of miscalculation. Miscalculation does not require madness. It requires only different fears. One state fears appearing weak, another fears waiting too long. Another fears being abandoned. Another fears being dragged in. Another fears economic collapse. Another fears domestic anger. Another fears loss of prestige. In the pressure chamber of the Middle East, each fear can produce a move that seems rational to the actor making it and reckless to the actor receiving it. The United States is the manager of this pressure chamber, but no manager controls every valve. It can pressure Israel privately, but it cannot erase Israel's security calculations. It can reassure the Gulf, but it cannot remove their geography. It can warn Iran, but it cannot guarantee Tehran's internal factions interpret warning as intended. It can coordinate with Europe, but Europe's military and energy capabilities are uneven. It can speak with China, but strategic rivalry limits trust. It can protect shipping, but ships move through real waters where drones, missiles, mines, small boats, accidents, and human error can turn theory into crisis. The numbers explain why America cannot ignore the region. In 2025, around 20 million barrels per day of oil and oil products transited the Strait of Hormuz, about a quarter of global seaborne oil trade, while more than 110 billion cubic meters of LNG also passed through the same route, close to 1/5 of global LNG trade. Roughly 80% of oil and oil products passing through Hormuz were destined for Asia. Almost all LNG exports from Qatar and the UAE had to pass through the strait, with no alternative route for those volumes. These figures are the strategic map. They show why the United States cannot simply turn away, even if it wants to. They show why China cannot be indifferent, even if it prefers others to police the route. They show why Europe must care, even when its direct Gulf dependence is lower than Asia's. They show why Gulf states must balance carefully, because their wealth flows through exposed corridors. They show why Iran's geography gives it influence beyond the size of its economy. They show why the Middle East remains a global issue, even in an age of artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, and digital finance. China's position is especially important. China is not the old imperial patrol power of the Gulf, but it is one of the great consumers of its energy. Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy reported that China's crude oil imports reached a record 11.6 million barrels per day in 2025. An analysis from War on the Rocks noted that China depends on imports for around 70% of its crude oil, with roughly 55% of its crude imports originating from the Middle East. This creates a quiet paradox. China benefits from an energy system whose maritime security has long been underwritten largely by American power. Beijing wants stability in the Gulf because instability threatens its industry, transport, petrochemicals, and broader economy. Yet China does not want to become the United States in the Middle East. It prefers influence without the same military burden, access without overexposure, diplomacy without inheriting the region's fires. This is rational, but it also reveals the structure of the global order. Many powers depend on stability. Fewer are willing or able to enforce it. Europe faces another version of vulnerability. Europe's direct dependence on Gulf oil and Qatari LNG may be lower than Asia's, but Europe remains exposed through price. After reducing dependence on Russian energy, Europe became more reliant on global LNG markets and more sensitive to competition for cargoes. ACER reported that during winter 2025-2026, EU LNG imports rose by 20%, while Qatar supplied about 7% of EU LNG imports, equivalent to roughly 3.5% of total EU gas imports. Those numbers may sound manageable, and in direct volume terms, they are. But energy security is not only direct volume, it is price competition. If Asian buyers lose or fear losing LNG volumes from the Gulf, they enter the spot market. If spot LNG tightens, European buyers pay more. If European gas prices rise, electricity prices may rise. If electricity rises, industry suffers. If industry suffers, governments face pressure. If governments subsidize, budgets suffer. If budgets suffer, politics tightens. This is how indirect exposure becomes direct pain. Europe learned after 2022 that energy dependence is not merely commercial, it is strategic. Pipelines, LNG terminals, storage levels, supplier concentration, and winter demand became matters of national security. The lesson was clear. The energy market can become a battlefield even when the battlefield is elsewhere. The Gulf extends that lesson. Europe may not be the main destination for Hormuz oil and gas, but it cannot insulate itself from a global energy price shock. In a connected market, distance reduces exposure. It does not eliminate it. The same is true for inflation. The European Central Bank warned in May 2026 that a new energy shock had pushed euro area headline inflation to 3% in April, driven by a 10.9% increase in energy prices, even while inflation excluding energy fell to 2.2%. That is the central banker's nightmare in numerical form. Underlying pressure may be improving, but energy can reopen the wound. A region trembles, oil and gas rise, and suddenly the path toward lower rates becomes less certain. The public hears that inflation is falling. Then the bill arrives. This is why the Middle East is not only a military theatre. It is an inflation theatre. It is an interest rate theatre. It is an election theatre. It is a debt theatre. It is a theatre where the price of a barrel, the route of a tanker, the credibility of a naval guarantee, and the rhetoric of leaders can influence the lives of people who have never heard of half the places involved. America understands this, but understanding does not equal mastery. The United States must defend a maritime order at a time when the domestic appetite for global policing is weaker than the global need for it. It must deter Iran without encouraging recklessness from partners. It must support Israel without allowing every Israeli calculation to define American strategy. It must reassure Gulf states without making them feel occupied by American risk. It must compete with China while recognizing that China also needs the Gulf to remain stable. It must manage oil prices without appearing to sacrifice security to markets. It must speak of principle while negotiating with necessity. No empire, republic, or superpower enjoys such contradictions forever. They strain the mind of leadership. They produce policy that looks too aggressive to one audience and too weak to another. If America strikes, critics call it reckless. If America restrains itself, critics call it declining. If it negotiates, critics call it naive. If it sanctions, critics call it ineffective. If it escorts ships, critics ask why American sailors must guard foreign cargo. If it does not, markets ask whether the sea lanes are still protected. This is the burden of the guarantor. Responsibility is visible when order fails, invisible when order holds. Israel also faces limits. Its military power is formidable, but Israel cannot control every consequence of action. It may destroy a target, delay a program, punish a hostile actor, or restore deterrence in one direction while creating escalation in another. Tactical success can become strategic uncertainty. A strike can produce relief in the morning and regional pressure by night. In the Middle East, the question is not only whether a target can be hit, the question is what the target connects to. Iran faces limits as well. It can pressure, threaten, and disrupt, but it cannot easily survive total regional isolation or unlimited escalation. Its economy is vulnerable. Its people have borne the weight of sanctions and domestic strain. Its partners are useful, but not always fully controllable. Its oil exports matter to its own survival. Its geography gives leverage, but leverage used too aggressively may invite the very coalition it seeks to deter. Iran may be skilled at the politics of uncertainty, but uncertainty is not a shield against every response. The Gulf faces limits. It has wealth, diplomacy, technology, air defences, and global influence. Yet it cannot move its geography. It cannot make Hormuz irrelevant overnight. It cannot guarantee that investors will remain calm if missiles and shipping threats become routine. It cannot simultaneously be a safe haven, energy giant, diplomatic bridge, military partner, and neutral observer without strain. It must balance between America, China, Iran, Israel, global markets, and domestic transformation. Balance is wisdom until the ground shakes. Europe faces limits. It can condemn, mediate, regulate, subsidize, diversify, and purchase LNG. But it still depends on global energy prices. It still lacks unified hard power equal to its economic scale. It still struggles with political fragmentation, industrial pressure, high living costs, and public fatigue. It can call for restraint, but restraint must be enforced by someone. It can speak of strategic autonomy, but autonomy requires capabilities, not vocabulary. China faces limits. It can buy oil, build influence, host diplomacy, invest, and speak the language of multipolar stability. But it cannot easily replace American naval power in the Gulf without assuming burdens it may not want. It cannot allow energy chaos without hurting itself. It cannot fully side with every anti-American actor while expecting uninterrupted access to a system partly protected by American force. China's rise gives it reach. Energy dependence gives it vulnerability. This is the true shape of the crisis. Every actor has power, and every actor has limits. The danger begins when power is remembered and limits are forgotten. Markets often understand limits before politicians admit them. The oil market knows spare capacity is finite. The LNG market knows terminals cannot appear overnight. The insurance market knows risk cannot be wished away. The bond market knows inflation changes interest rate paths. The currency market knows importers suffer when energy rises. The equity market knows high rates compress valuations. The voter knows life is expensive, even if the explanation is complex. The market may be emotional, but it is not blind to constraints. This is why finance is never separate from war. It only pretends to be separate during peaceful intervals. A stock index may rise on earnings optimism while a sea lane remains calm. A currency may strengthen on rate expectations while tankers move safely. A government may borrow cheaply while inflation appears contained. But when the fire spreads, finance remembers its dependence on order. It remembers that debt assumes future stability. It remembers that inflation assumes supply. It remembers that trade assumes roots. It remembers that valuation assumes peace. The illusion that finance floats above geopolitics is one of the great conceits of our age. Money travels through wires, but value travels through the world. Factories need inputs. Energy needs routes. Ships need security. Currencies need trust. Bonds need governments that can pay. Stocks need consumers who can spend. Central banks need inflation they can understand. Technology companies need supply chains. Artificial intelligence needs electricity. Electricity needs grids, gas, uranium, copper, rare earths, finance, and political stability. There is no escape from the physical world. There is only denial. The Middle East tears away that denial. It shows that the world economy is not a cloud. It is a machine with pipes, ships, cables, ports, refineries, terminals, grids, bases, and choke points. It shows that the modern citizen, despite all the elegance of digital life, remains connected to ancient concerns. Security of routes, price of food, cost of heat, strength of alliances, and discipline of leaders. This is why the danger of miscalculation is so severe. A miscalculation in the Gulf does not stay neatly inside the Gulf. It can move into oil, LNG, freight, insurance, inflation, interest rates, elections, and public anger. It can force central banks to delay easing, governments to subsidize, militaries to deploy, investors to retreat, and citizens to lose patience. It can make every government look less competent, even those that did not cause the crisis. It can turn distant strategy into domestic punishment. And public anger is the final accelerant. Democracies and authoritarian systems alike fear public anger, though they manage it differently. In democracies, anger moves through elections, protests, parties, media, and trust. In authoritarian systems, anger moves more quietly until it becomes dangerous. Inflation, energy costs, and food prices are among the fastest ways to make politics unstable because they create a feeling that the future is being stolen. When people believe that work no longer protects them from decline, they become open to harder voices. This is where war risk, oil prices, debt, elections, and market psychology converge. A government facing election pressure may choose a sharper foreign policy to appear strong. Another may avoid necessary action to keep fuel prices low. A central bank may keep rates high to preserve credibility, angering borrowers. A finance ministry may subsidize energy and worsen debt. A rival power may exploit domestic division. Markets may interpret political instability as financial risk. Financial risk may raise borrowing costs. Borrowing costs may deepen public anger. The circle tightens. Civilizations rarely fail because danger was invisible. More often, they fail because visible danger was explained away. The signs were present, but inconvenient. The warnings were heard, but softened. The assumptions were fragile, but profitable. The roots were exposed, but cheap. The debt was heavy, but manageable until it was not. The public was angry, but leaders hoped growth would return before anger organized. The adversary was dangerous, but not dangerous enough to demand hard choices. The system was vulnerable, but it had survived before, and survival became an argument against preparation. This is the final warning of this episode. The fire beneath the markets is not only Iran, it is not only oil, it is not only the Strait of Hormuz, it is not only Israel, America, the Gulf, Europe, or China. The fire is the gap between the world we imagine and the world that exists. We imagine that markets are rational, that leaders are disciplined, that routes remain open, that energy transitions are smooth, that inflation is conquered, that alliances are permanent, that enemies calculate calmly, and that tomorrow will always forgive today's negligence. But the world that exists is harsher. It is made of interests, fear, pride, geography, machines, money, memory, and men under pressure. The Middle East does not allow illusions to live forever. It reveals the cost of dependence. It exposes the limits of force. It punishes lazy strategy. It reminds great powers that superiority is not omnipotence. It reminds smaller powers that disruption is not safety. It reminds markets that price is not truth, but a nervous estimate. It reminds citizens that peace is not an abstraction. Peace is the hidden subsidy beneath daily life. What then should a serious civilization do? It must begin by refusing both panic and complacency. Panic burns judgment. Complacency buries it. A serious civilization must build resilience before crisis, not slogans during crisis. It must diversify energy without pretending transition has already arrived. It must protect sea lanes without confusing military movement with strategy. It must negotiate without worshipping weakness. It must deter without worshipping force. It must tell citizens the truth, that prosperity depends upon order, and order requires cost. Courage is not recklessness. Restraint is not surrender. Discipline is not passivity. These are the three virtues a dangerous age demands. Courage to face threats clearly. Restraint to avoid turning every threat into a wider fire. Discipline to prepare long before the market screams, the voter rages, and the ships stop moving. America must remember that leadership is not only the ability to strike, but the ability to hold a system together. Israel must remember that security is not only the destruction of threats, but the management of consequences. The Gulf must remember that wealth without resilience is exposed confidence. Europe must remember that moral language without hard capacity is often only a speech. China must remember that benefiting from order while avoiding responsibility is easier in calm seas than in storm. Iran must remember that pressure can win attention, but escalation can devour the hand that applies it. And the ordinary citizen must remember something too. The price of fuel, food, electricity, credit, and stability is not born only in domestic politics. It is born in the architecture of power. It is born in the straits, ports, pipelines, sanctions, alliances, wars, and choices that most people do not see until the bill arrives. This is why we study such moments, not to predict every missile, every barrel, every speech, or every market movement. No honest analysis can do that. We study them to understand the forces beneath the headline. We study them because a society that cannot read power will eventually be punished by power. We study them because the world is changing and the cost of misunderstanding it is rising. Iran, oil, and the Middle East are not separate from the modern economy. They are among the places where the economy reveals its dependence on peace. The markets may speak in numbers, but beneath the numbers are ships. Beneath the ships are routes. Beneath the routes are military guarantees. Beneath the guarantees are political decisions. Beneath the decisions are leaders, voters, fears, ambitions, memories, and mistakes. The fire beneath the markets is therefore not a metaphor only. It is the heat generated when fragile peace carries too much weight, when energy dependence meets strategic rivalry, when debt meets inflation, when domestic anger meets foreign danger, and when great powers discover that they can influence events without fully controlling them. The lesson is severe, but not hopeless. The world is fragile, but not doomed. Roots can be protected. Diplomacy can work. Deterrence can hold. Energy systems can become more resilient. Markets can adapt. Citizens can be told the truth. Leaders can choose discipline over theatre. The future is not written by danger alone. It is written by how clearly danger is seen and how wisely power is used. But wisdom must arrive before the explosion, not after it. That is the burden of statesmanship. That is the duty of serious nations. That is the warning hidden inside every oil price, every shipping alert, every inflation print, every naval deployment, every diplomatic message, and every headline that seems distant until it becomes personal. Civilizations are not destroyed only by enemies. They are weakened by illusions. They are weakened when comfort becomes strategy, when markets become theology, when debt becomes habit, when energy becomes someone else's problem, when citizens are soothed instead of prepared, and when leaders mistake the absence of disaster for proof of control. The world now stands before a region that can shake the global economy, not because it is large, but because it is central, not because every actor seeks catastrophe, but because too many actors possess the means to create it. Not because oil is the future, but because oil is still the present. Not because markets are foolish, but because markets know how much rests upon fragile peace. And so the final word must be this: understand power before power punishes those who ignore it. Understand that oil is not merely fuel, it is leverage. Understand that shipping is not merely trade, it is civilization in motion. Understand that inflation is not merely a statistic, it is political fire. Understand that America is mighty but not limitless. Understand that Israel is formidable but not free from consequence. Understand that the Gulf is wealthy but exposed. Understand that Europe is advanced but vulnerable. Understand that China is rising but dependent. Understand that Iran is pressured but capable of pressure. Understand that markets are fast but not wise enough to save societies from bad strategy. The age ahead will not reward those who sleep beneath comforting phrases. It will reward those who see clearly, prepare early, speak honestly, restrain wisely, and act with courage when courage is required. For beneath the markets, the fire is real. And history is watching to see whether we recognize the heat before it becomes flame.